Welcome everybody. My name is Mindy Clues and I'm based in Equinox IT's Wellington office. Here at Equinox IT, I coordinate our learning services. Equinox IT injects fresh thinking to solve tough business problems. We deliver software development, consulting and training services. Today, I'm joined by Bill Ross. Bill is a principal consultant here at Equinox IT and he works alongside me in our Wellington office. Bill has extensive experience in software development and consulting and in all aspects of architecture. He's also an Equinox IT certified instructor, and he regularly delivers public and in-house training to our clients. Today, Bill will be presenting on lean architecture, architecting in an agile world. If you have questions during the webinar, please enter these in the right-hand side console. We may answer these as we go, otherwise we'll answer them at the end in the Q&A session. We will be recording this webinar today and we'll email you next week to show you where you can find the recording to share with your colleagues. We plan to finish today at 12:45 and right now I'll hand over to Bill. Bill, welcome.
Good, thank you, Mindy. Thank you and welcome to all of you who have tuned in for today's webinar. Today I'll be discussing the impact for people who are involved in architecting or architecture, the impact of Agile and working in Agile teams, projects or organisations that are endeavouring to become more Agile. We'll cover 5 specific areas. First, I want to give an overview and background of Agile, where it has come from and how it's grown. Secondly, I'll just recap what doing architecture, or what I consider doing architecture, really involves. Next, putting those 2 things together, Agile, lean approaches and architecture, what does that all mean? We'll also look at a bit of detail at how being an architect, how you can be involved with Agile Scrum teams, Scrum being one of the most popular Agile approaches. And then finally, we'll just sort of wrap up and look at what does it mean for you if you are working as an architect or working with architects. So, what is this Agile or lean world we're either living in or most people are moving to? Just to sort of go back to the beginning, what I've shown here is the manifesto for Agile software development. Many of you may have seen this before. It's been around since about 2001. What we're going to do is, I just want you to just look at that and look at the 4 main points there. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. And near the end of the webinar, we're just going to do a little put up a poll just to see what people's experiences are around those 4 areas. I'll just actually hand over to Mindy to describe how that poll will work and the question we'll ask.
So when we launch the poll, you'll have the opportunity to submit your response. And you can do that simply by entering your response online. When we have those poll results in, I'll share those with you and you'll be able to see what your peers and colleagues on the webinar have to say about that. Bill and I will have a brief discussion about the results that we're seeing.
Okay, thanks, Mindy. Okay, so getting back into what is this Agile lean world we're living in? So quite a while ago, there was this extreme programming, which some of you may have been involved with or heard of, created by Kent Beck and Ward Cunningham. Around the same time, there was this idea of a Scrum process for Agile development, created by Ken Schwaber. Around 2001, the Agile manifesto we saw previously, a bunch of thought leaders got together and created this Agile software development manifesto, and the group formed what they called the Agile Alliance. Then lean concepts from lean manufacturing, as described by Edward Deming from his work in Japan with Toyota in production lines and product development, were incorporated into Agile thinking by Mary and Tom Pubendek. Some of the supporting principles from lean included things like focusing on the customer, eliminating waste and enhanced learning. Then further evolution involved bringing in the ideas from Kanban, made by a guy called David Anderson. Kanban is based on what's known as complex adaptive systems, and it reinforced techniques such as visualizing workflow, limiting the work in progress, and a pull model for workload management. More recently, there's been a lot of work in the areas of scaling agile approaches from individual teams up to entire enterprises or organisations. Work in this space includes what's known as large-scale Scrum, or LESS, being developed by Craig Larman and Bas Vode, and also the Scaled Agile Framework, as developed by Dean Leffingwell. It's also impacted in other areas apart from software development projects. The very popular Prince2 project management certification now has an Agile certification, which was released recently. And in the area of business analysis, the International Institute of Business Analysis, they have their BA Body of Knowledge, or BABOK, and they've actually added to their body of knowledge a 130-page document called the Agile Extension, so they're sort of taking it on board as well. Now, generally, these Agile approaches are now moving well beyond just software development projects, and they're encompassing other areas of IT with things such as DevOps and continuous delivery, and even reaching right across the organisation with certifications for things like enterprise agility. And organisations like the International Consortium for Agile have a range of certifications that are actually aimed at the whole organisation. Now, the term Agile can be considered really an umbrella term. It sort of goes across all these ideas and techniques. But to summarise all this down, to what does it really mean? It's not an easy thing because there's a lot of content there. But I think the common theme across all of it is really it's about culture change. Okay, so in terms of culture change, what are we talking about in terms of Agile? Well, for organisations to remain relevant and competitive in a fast-moving and changing environment and marketplace, really requires them to become more innovative, lean, and agile. Now, this can be a significant cultural change, especially for those organisations that are moving from maybe a more ingrained, maybe command and control culture, where they have managers who are considered to be responsible for the coordination and directing, as opposed to an agile approach which really focuses on self-organising teams to essentially direct themselves as to the best way to achieve outcomes. The culture of an agile team, project, organisation has certain characteristics. Some of the key ones being this idea of collective responsibility. So specific individuals may not, in an agile organisation, be accountable for the team's outcome. All members of the team are responsible, and they either succeed or fail as a unit. This requires a culture of team ownership of the outcomes. And I guess the analogy would be a sports team. In a sports team, the team either wins or loses. Individuals within the team don't independently win or lose. The other key element is flexibility. The new economic and market realities are such that constant change is inevitable. And to survive in such an environment requires flexibility to change direction and to reprioritise activities. Now, the chances of creating a perfect plan and expecting reality to unfold as per the plan is, just simply unrealistic. Projects and organisations need to be consistently re-evaluating the situation they're in, creating shorter-term plans, implementing those plans, but then quickly evaluating the outcomes and then replanning. And this needs to be done in quite short cycles or iterations. Another key cultural area is the area of trust. For any team or organisation to be optimally effective requires that the team members trust each other. However, trust generally has to be earned. It can't be assumed. Therefore, keeping teams together for reasonable periods gives time for trust levels to grow between the team members. Now, I know some organisations seem to be in a constant round of restructures, which can be very disruptive for people to integrate into teams and actually have time to form those trust relationships with the people they work with. I imagine many of you have heard of Bruce Tuckman's cycle of team formation, where they go through the stages of forming, storming, then norming, and then ultimately performing. Unfortunately, if you have a lot of regular restructures, you can spend a lot of time in the forming and storming stages and never actually get to norming and performing. Another key element is open communication and collaboration. Information should be available to anyone who needs it for the decisions that have to be made. and information hiding or knowledge, or hiding information or knowledge to somehow have power is really just not acceptable in an agile organisation or project. Therefore, we're not looking at, an architect can't be an autocratic design authority, but is more the role of facilitator and communicators who can work with the various stakeholders and technical experts to come to a consensus on decisions in a timely manner. Okay, so that sort of summarise what Agile essentially is. Now, what is architecture? Well, I think the essence of architecture, in my experience, is really it's primarily about making decisions to address the key concerns of stakeholders. Now, the sorts of concerns are such things as the key functional requirements of the system or solution, risk, cost, system qualities or non-functional areas like security, maintainability, usability, performance, etc. And it's less about necessarily following a process or delivering specific artifacts or deliverables, or about authority or control. Also, in today's complex technical environments, it can't be expected that a person with architect in their title or their role name can actually know everything. And the role will often be one of engaging with those who are the experts and facilitating a consensus decision, and then that consensus decision making and capturing the rationale about why the decisions that have been made are what they are. Okay, I just sort of cover off. I'm very familiar with what I'm about to show. This is often the architectural sort of major areas you have in enterprise architecture, solution systems architecture, and maybe software architecture and design at the more detailed level. And architects who may be listening in may be working in one or more of these spaces. And at the bottom level, we're really looking at internal design decisions, user experience, code quality, and people architects working in that area have normally very, very strong technical capabilities in the implementation domain. Solution systems architects may be looking at maybe higher level issues like do we even bother building a system? Should we just buy one or use software as a service? And looking at integration between applications. And enterprise architecture is really looking about strategic alignment and across enterprise standards, etc., and use frameworks like the Open Group Architectural Framework or TOGAF. Okay, so who's making these architectural decisions? Well, ideally, it really has to be the person or people with the necessary skills, knowledge, experience, and know-how to make a good decision. And then I guess this should be self-evident. And the person may also happen to have the word architect in their job title, but maybe it's a matter of the architect finding the person who does have the experience and knowledge and working with them to come to a consensus on a decision. And as mentioned earlier, architects don't often know all the answers. They need to facilitate agreement and very importantly, capture the rationale for why a particular decision has been made. Okay, we'll now look at when decisions are made, and this is probably a key difference in Agile approach. The diagram here has the classic waterfall sort of approach to development. It's been pretty much recognised as, except for the very simple situations, as not an entirely realistic approach to any non-trivial system. Now, in terms of making decisions as and when you need to, the waterfall model doesn't really support this idea of doing it at the last responsible moment. Now, this concept of making, basically delaying decisions until you know more, you've got a better picture, you have better information available, i.e. the last responsible moment. Waterfall sort of forces you to make these decisions, in this particular stage in design. But a hang of a lot is going to be learnt normally during implementation and test, which will impact those design decisions. So really, as an approach, Waterfall does not support making decisions at the last responsible moment. Okay, there's also this concept of, often you hear in Agile, of laying down what they call architectural runway. So basically making decisions just in time to lay down sufficient runway, architectural runway for the implementation, to land, to use. You're laying them to the last responsible moment. The key word there being responsible. So not necessarily the very last moment, but the last responsible moment. The decisions are based on benefit, risks, costs, and other concerns. And in some cases, it may even involve putting down temporary runway, where you recognise that, we're making potentially a decision that we may change, but it's recognised as such, and it's recognised as potential technical debt, and you can have a strategy for managing that technical debt. Okay, so we've sort of looked at Agile in terms of as being a culture change. We've looked at Lean architecture in terms of decision making and when those decisions are made and who makes those decisions. We've got this sort of phrase, so Agile architecture, and it can actually be interpreted in two ways. First, you could say that a system has an Agile architecture in that it's versatile, easy to evolve, to modify, etc. And then secondly, you could talk about Agile architecture as an Agile approach to doing architecture, using an Agile or Lean life cycle, allowing the architecture to evolve, etc. Now, the two are not the same. You could have a non-Agile development process that potentially could produce an adaptable and flexible architecture, and vice versa. Or you could have an Agile process that leads to a rather rigid and inflexible architecture. So one doesn't necessarily imply the other. But maybe, for obvious reasons, in the best of both worlds, we'd like to actually have an Agile process that leads to a flexible architecture. Most of this remaining bits of the webinar will probably focus on the second meaning, i.e. it's about the process more so than the actual implementation of a flexible architecture. Okay, so we put these things together. The prime deliverable really from Agile architecture is actionable decisions. Those decisions are made with those with the best understanding, made at the last responsible moment, and the formality of the decision needs to be just at the right level to effectively communicate it to those who are concerned about the decision. So in summary, really, it's just the right person doing just enough architecture just in time. Sounds easy enough. But Philip Critchin, who was involved in the Rational Unified process, had this quote, the life of a software architect is a long and rapid succession of suboptimal design decisions taken partly in the dark. So really not necessarily much has changed since those days. Okay, we talked about decisions. Let's going to talk a bit more now about this concept of architecturally significant design decisions. Now, any non-trivial system normally involves hundreds, if not thousands, of specific design decisions. Now, these decisions could range from, does the project even undertake a custom software development, or should we just use a software as a service approach, down to almost moment-by-moment decisions that the developers could be making as to, do I introduce a new class? What should I call this method? What parameters should I pass into it, which are much more at the lower level? But of all these design decisions that are made for any solution, some of those decisions are what we call architecturally significant, i.e. some need to be made before subsequent decisions or activities can occur. Some decisions are very difficult or expensive to change, and some decisions have a significant impact on some key system quality, such as security or performance. Now, so these types of decisions are referred to as architecturally significant. They're still design decisions, as the Venn diagram is trying to show, but they are the subset of all decisions that are architecturally significant. Now, you'll see that we haven't got a very clear boundary in this Venn diagram, and that's because this boundary is grey, and decisions can cross it throughout a project as understanding evolves. So in a waterfall approach, you're sort of assuming there was a clear boundary. But because you don't know a lot, there's actually things that you could have thought were architecturally significant and turn out to be, actually not that important decisions. And more unfortunately, you can discover things later in the project which were considered to be, minor decisions, but actually appear to become, or actually are architecturally significant. So they sort of cross the boundary later on. So, and that's, I guess you'd call the devil in the details situation that you always need to be aware of as an architect. What I'm going to describe now is something that actually came from Alju Port, from an article in IEEE Software magazine, and he describes what he calls the architecting decision microcycle. It sort of works as follows. Essentially, you have architectural concerns which have been identified by the architect or others, and essentially you need to prioritise and identify and prioritise those concerns. So, the ones that are pressing are addressed first. You then looking at, figuring out the options that are available for addressing those concerns. And that may involve doing some research, maybe doing even some spike development or evaluation of options. Essentially then doing this decision making, deciding the best fit solution for those high priority decisions. Then effectively going through the cycle again. What you're delivering is these architectural decisions. And this way of looking at architecture is compatible with an agile approach, regardless of whether those decisions are emerging from early implementation and refactoring, careful upfront modeling maybe, or a combination of that. So in agile projects, decisions often emerge from a group process with shared ownership. But even then it makes sense to look to an architect as a person who safeguards the overall design's conceptual integrity. So really the role of the architect is to make sure that the group's decisions are consistent across the whole solution, even when multiple teams are working on it simultaneously. So just trying to fit that architecture decision microcycle into the common, say, Scrum approach to development. What we have here is a simplified version of the Scrum process, which some of you may be familiar with, but essentially we have product backlog, then from that a subset of features go into a sprint backlog, which could be from 1 to 4 weeks. The sprint itself with a daily stand-up meeting, and at the end of the sprint we have a solution increment or some part of the solution delivered. Okay, so we have these architectural concerns as from the previous slide. We have the architecting microcycle, which is identifying and prioritizing the architectural concerns, researching and trying solutions and deciding the best fitting solution. Then you essentially have the architectural decisions, and then feeding into the product backlog and moving through to development and the impact on development. I think a key point of this is showing that engagement model where the architect has regular involvement with the team. It doesn't have to be daily as this sort of implies, but the point is they should be involved. Okay, so looking at this more deeply in terms of how an architect could be involved with Agile Scrum teams. Scrum's probably one of the most, or if not the most popular development approach for doing Agile. So we'll just, again, similar to what we saw previously, this overview really of the Scrum approach. For those that don't know, Scrum has some certain rules around the team. The team is made up of the development team. It says development, but it's really a mixture of all the skills needed to fulfill the solution increment. So that can include testing, analysis, and architecture. We have the product owner who prioritizes the work, provides details of requirements, and generally defines what needs to be done from the client's perspective. And we also have the Scrum Master, who is responsible for the Scrum process being followed and generally guiding the team and stakeholders in the implementation of Scrum. Now that whole group is collectively generally called the Scrum team. Now outside the Scrum team, you have other stakeholders or advisors who will provide input, but normally aren't involved on a day-to-day basis with the work of the Scrum team. But they will be working often with the product owner, essentially trying to influence the product owner in terms of what should be on the backlog and what prioritize and the prioritization of items in the backlog. Now looking at this model, there's at a high level 3 main areas or 3 places where architecture could be directly involved. The first really is an architect or people with architecture skills actually in the Scrum team as software architects, technical leads or master programmers. And it doesn't have to be even a named individual. It could just be that you've got more experienced people who are better suited and have the skills to make some of those software type architecture decisions. Another possibility is the architect as the solution architect or system architect being the product owner. This can be the situation when a product is part of a shared platform that is expected to be reused by other products and projects within the organisation. Examples of this might be development of a shared single sign-on authorization service, maybe a set of libraries that are being developed that are expected or planned to be used across the organisation. Interestingly, the Shared Agile Framework, or SAFe, describes this as an approach for, they have a role called system architect, and they sometimes have the system architect fulfilling the product owner role when they're adding features to the architectural runway. And the third one is really the architect not directly in the Scrum team, but is really a stakeholder or an advisor. This may be more like enterprise architects involved in this area, where essentially they're trying to influence the product owner and team to ensure their architectural concerns are met, and probably not. There shouldn't be a prescription of how they should be met, but just saying that whatever the concerns are, they should be met. Okay, so moving on to the last section. So what does all this mean for you, as an architect? Take into account, we talked about, essentially it's cultural change. The primary thing you're delivering is actionable decisions, and you've got to be closely involved with agile teams. What does it mean for you as an architect? Well, we'll just go back to the beginning here and look at this, the Agile manifesto, and we're doing the poll now. So we'll bring up the question.
Yep, I'll just launch the poll for you all now, and you can see on your screen you can make your selection. Phil, in your experience recently, where have you had to where have you learnt your biggest lessons?
Yeah, it's a good question. This is I think the interactions and individual interactions that I mentioned earlier, that idea of building up trust, and trust takes time. And if you haven't worked with people before, you've got to establish those trust relationships. I think that for me is often one where if I'm going in as a consulting role, I may not have worked with those people previously. So establishing that up front can be very important. And also, I think that for me, the last one, often there'll be a plan, and sometimes those plans can be very detailed. So the last one, where they have a plan, but what you're learning as you're undertaking the actual development project means that the plan is sort of no longer correct or relevant, and the expectation where people sometimes can ignore the reality and just want to still follow the plan, even if it's not necessarily still taking them where they want to go.
So if there are others of you that would like to vote, please do so now. I'll be closing that poll in a few seconds. Bill, interestingly, the smallest proportion of people are saying that the most challenging is working software over comprehensive documentation.
So that's the most.
So the smallest percentage of people
are
saying that that's their problem.
Okay, so that's not a problem. Okay, no. Well that's probably a good sign. I know some organisations sort of sometimes rate the non-software deliverables as more important than the software itself, which can be a concern. Although I think that's probably one where what is the expectation in terms of the documentation. What's the leading one there? Responding to change over following a plan. Yep, that would reflect my experiences. So I'm glad to see actually the top two actually match match my experience. Is that closed yet, Minnie?
It is.
Yeah. Okay.
It is. I'm going to hide those results now, Bill, and you can.
No, that's interesting. But interestingly, there is across the board, some issues across all of them. That's great. Thank you for that. Okay, so just moving on from there. So, in terms of those four principles, there is let's kind of look at ways of aligning those Agile Manifesto principles with our architecture. Now, what I'm showing you here is actually a work from Owen Woods. Some of you may know him. The book he wrote with Brzezinski, the Brzezinski and Woods book on software systems architecture, has been it's quite popular. But he also does a regular article in the IEEE Software magazine, and he had this thing about he was matching it onto the Agile Manifesto. So people over processes and tools, and sharing information using simple tools. Now, the architect's job includes communicating the architecture to relevant stakeholders, such as infrastructure designers, compliance officers, and as well as the development team. So effective communication is often best achieved using the simple, familiar mechanisms such as wikis or presentations and short, accessible documents. Also, the point of having a customer for every deliverable. Now, every deliverable needs to have someone who is going to read it or use it. It can sometimes, as an architect, it can become easy to spend a lot of time creating a seemingly important document that in reality no one will actually read to any great degree. Now, in terms of lean principles, that's considered essentially waste, i.e. you're producing something that's never used. Okay, in the area of software over documentation, this concept of create good enough architectural artifacts. Architectural documents are a means to an end, i.e. getting a system up and running, not an end in themselves. Therefore, documents that are produced need to be fit for purpose, but they don't have to be perfect if there's no real value added by doing so. This concept of delivering something that runs. Now, only a running solution truly validates all the architectural and design decisions that are made. Therefore, rather than spend time on documents, theorising, on the architecture's suitability, that time is probably far better spent validating the decision via an example or a prototype, and defining the solutions for the cross-cutting concerns. I think this is particularly where architects can add value. You've got system qualities such as security, performance, scalability, etc., which are considered cross-cutting because they cut across the structure of the solution and the functionality. Now, high value can be provided by the architect by providing sort of proven solutions for those cross-cutting concerns, so the team can really focus on the functional value delivered to the customer. Okay, this area of collaboration over contracts. This work in teams, don't just deliver documents. Now, sometimes this is a common misconception or complaint that architects work separately from the people who are actually impacted by their decisions. So architects need to collaborate with the teams and ideally work directly with them whenever possible. This supports this two-way flow of information, ensuring that the architect understands the real problems occurring and can refine the architecture as the system is being built. And focusing the design work on stakeholder concerns is another key area. Then finally looking at allowing for change. So delivering incrementally, we touched on earlier, an architect really needs to share his architectural design work early and not sort of be tempted to try and make it perfect before they share it with anybody. As discussed under the idea of architectural runway earlier, the architect should deliver the key architectural decisions early and then sort of provide a flow of decisions ongoing, when needed, to meet the development team's delivery goals. This will allow the architecture to better cope with changing priorities and allow decisions to be made, when more complete information is available. A good way of communicating sort of architectural direction is via architectural principles, which sort of guide other design decisions. And then just to ensure that decisions are captured along with the rationale for the decisions. That could just be on a wiki, or doesn't have to be a high formality sort of deliverable, and also defining the components involved clearly. Okay. Owen Woods also had this other article which he talked about the analogy or the idea of the architecting in the gaps. Now this is a metaphor where there's gaps normally between boundaries. The first one, these technical boundaries, people are probably quite familiar with who do architecture, the interfaces between components, which architects are often more concerned with the lines on these diagrams as opposed to the boxes. But then there's other sorts of gaps that need to be considered. Now, another one is organisation collaboration boundaries. And often the work of the architect can be involved in ensuring that there's communications between these areas occur and that everything is aligned. Another organisational boundary gap or boundary gap that can exist is conceptual boundaries. When you're sort of going down from maybe a conceptual or abstract level down to the logical and the physical, there are gaps between each of those layers of abstraction, and it's often that the architect has to ensure that those gaps are clearly mapped. Okay, I'm just going to look at some stuff, a few slides just to make you aware of them more than anything. From the LESS framework, large-scale Scrum, they have a number of what they call tips in their framework to do with architecture and design. They've actually got quite, I think, over 40 of them. I'm not going to show you them all. Just got a couple of slides which have some of the more, I think, interesting ones. So the first one they have really is to do with the way we even think about architecture. And, is architecture as per building architecture a good metaphor? Probably not. They're saying maybe gardening would be a better way of thinking of it, i.e. evolving a growing architectural design over time. They have certain behavioural tips, which question all decisions. So, don't assume that because a decision made it is final. You may have to revisit decisions. Develop a working skeleton. Do the customer important features first, which is always good advice. Clarify by basically doing programming spikes. So again, this is like researching the way things are going to work. Just keeping the Agile solution architecture document with views and technical memos, keeping it sort of a low key. Technical leaders actually being teachers during the code review. So it's not so much a reviewing process as a teaching approach for code review. And also another element is design, architecture, and communities of practice. Okay, they also have some behaviours to avoid, and including those lists are, just conformance to outdated decisions. You may, again, as per the previous slide, don't assume that all decisions are final. Avoiding architectural astronauts or the PowerPoint architects who may be fine at the conceptual level but aren't really much help when it comes to realising the implementation. Sometimes you get the other point where some people say, "Oh, don't model; it's not worth it." Model if it's useful. Modelling, can be a very useful approach, and really, it's the usefulness of the models you create for the architecture that's important. There's actually Professor George Box had a good quote where he said that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. So it's really that point that you want useful models. Try to avoid this concept of just architects hand them off to coders, which really is just reinforcement of the sort of waterfall idea. And just try to avoid these review points where the experts come in and review it, and it sort of can hold the whole process up. You really want that to be review almost happening constantly as part of doing the work. Okay, and the last one they have is just some technical tips about using things like dependency injection, maybe test-driven development, avoiding detailed upfront interface design, which is an interesting one. Their approach really is to start with what they call weakly typed interfaces. And then as you develop the system and it evolves, you get a much better understanding of the real needs of the interfaces and then strengthen them subsequently. I also want to touch on some work from a chap called Dana Brademeyer. I was very lucky to attend a couple of courses by Dana Brademeyer quite a few years ago on software and enterprise architecture. Dana defined an architect competency framework, which I thought was really good. And it's divided into these 5 areas of technology, strategy, consulting, organisational politics, and leadership. Now, the first 2 are sort of what I'd call the hard skills, knowing the technology and knowing how to do strategy. But the bottom 3 obviously are some more soft skills, consulting, politics, and leadership. And across these 5 areas, he sort of said, well, for each of these areas, what do you need to know? What do you actually do? And probably most important of all, who are you? So just looking at the couple of examples of that. So under technology, in terms of what you know, well, okay, you need to know the technology, you need to know the domain you're working in, what you do. Interestingly, there's things there like prototype, experiment, simulate. Now, he, have had this framework even before Agile became well known, and even then he was talking about that prototyping and experimentation. And I think most importantly of all is the who you are thing here, where you're creative, investigative, pragmatic, practical, tolerant of ambiguity, etc. Willing to backtrack. So all those things really are, to me, sort of aligned with Agile approaches. We'll also now just look at the consulting. So what consulting techniques, solicitation techniques. Under the doing, we have you understand what developers want and need from an architecture. You can help developers see the value of the architecture. And again, in terms of who you are, you're committed to others' success, emphatic, approachable, change agent, a mentor and a teacher. So again, I think these are totally aligned with Agile culture approach. And lastly, I'll just look at what he had under leadership in terms of his competency framework. Okay, what you need to know is yourself, making decisions, which we've touched on, building teams, and again, in terms of who you are, there's a list of things there which you're committed, dedicated, passionate, which if you're working in a team, you should be if you've got an effective team. Okay, so one way of looking at architecture is this concept of guardrails. So to do this, you need to understand all the forces that need to be considered in the context of a solution. Now, these forces include the key functional requirements, the constraints you're working under, and you once you understand those, you need to clarify the boundaries given those constraints. So once you've the architectural forces are understood and agreed, then the guardrails or boundaries will be defined, and this can be communicated via architectural principles. And then really agreement on destination, where you're going. And then so this concept of, so basically, finally, you're providing guidance to the project ongoing by staying between the lines. So just to summarise, architecting is essentially decision making. However, they don't have to all be made up front. They don't all have to just be made by the architect, and they don't all require a high level of formality. The architecture really needs to grow as the knowledge of the problem and the system you're building and the domain grows. And lean architecting is about you're part of a collaborative team, you want to reduce waste, ensure quality, and finally, who you are and what you do is probably more important, or is more important than just what you know. So thank you. That's my bit in it.
Thanks, Bill. That's been a fabulously informative session. Now, just before we ask a couple of questions that have come through from the participants, any of you out there who are interested in learning more about Agile and architecture from us here at Equinox IT, you'll see up on your screen links to a couple of pages where you can find out more about our training. If you are keen to hear what we have to say, you're welcome to subscribe to our blog, and you'll see there's a couple of links up there that you can follow. Simply enter your email address, let us know how often you'd like to hear from us, and we'll update you when we've got something new to say. Bill, we have a couple of questions through. One from Mark. How do you ensure the last responsible moment is the most responsible moment?
Well, that's a good question, Mark, and thanks for that. Last and most. This is a good question, and I guess if you're talking about part of it being responsible, it would also is last responsible. Does it imply it's also the most responsible? I know that Philip Pritchard, who I mentioned earlier, sort of has trouble with this with this concept of the last responsible moment, because how do you prove one way or the other or know when it is? And really, I don't think it's actually something you can measure. But I think if you feel you're making a decision and you're being forced to make a decision just because it's a deadline, when you don't really feel comfortable with the decision or you don't feel you know enough about the information, are you being responsible and making a decision at that point?
And one final question. Final question through from Jane. Jane is wanting to know what advice you have for her as an architect about to work on her first Agile project.
Okay, another very good question. I think the key thing is to do with building those relationships with the team. Now, I don't know whether you're actually, if you like, embedded in the project or how the relationship as an architect, how you're related to the project, but it's really building those trust relationships with those involved, and really seeing how best you can add value to them. And I think that's the key thing. You're part of the team that has collective responsibility for the outcome, as opposed to, I think some architects can see their role as being more of a stop-go policeman, where they review things and say yes, no, which I don't think is really at all aligned with an agile approach.
Thanks, Bill. That's all we've got time for today. As I mentioned earlier, this webinar has been recorded, so if you believe others will get value from it, we'll send you a link that you can share. When you sign out today, you'll be asked to complete an evaluation, and that helps us get better at delivering webinars and content that you find valuable. Thanks again, Bill, for a fantastic and value-packed webinar.